Alright folks, sorry about the traffic. There's nothing I can do about it. It's like 3:30 in the afternoon. This is my town's memorial for 9/11. On this day, back in September 11th, 2001, 2,996 people lost their lives. That I-beam there and that I-beam there are part of the towers. Some of our fire departments up here went down there to help with recovery. Crazy enough, at 8:22, Flight 11 traveled between Glens Falls, New York and Saratoga Springs, New York, which is, its path went 15 miles from this spot. So when it left at 8:46, Flight 11, American 11, took off from Boston. It then traveled up through New York, and yeah, so I'll always make a memory video for the brave men and women who lost their lives on this day and changed America forever. Well, greetings and salutations, everyone. I hope everyone is still doing well, and welcome to tonight's second half. Before we jump into tonight's second half, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon, and folks, please leave a comment. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, folks, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to today's second half, shall we? Today's first part of the upload. I was serving my second tour in Vietnam when the whole deal was called off. All the boys that could come home did, but unfortunately many good men were left behind. As I try to recall the remainder of the 70s, it all seems like a big blur, both mentally and physically. I was shot, having left it all behind on the table in Nam. I was as lost as a soul can be, and found myself drinking heavily, smoking a lot of weed, which went on unabated until about 1979. At that time, I made a move to Lake Tahoe, hoping for a fresh start at life. While I was in the barber shop waiting for a cut one day, I noticed a magazine lying on the chair and opened it to a page that featured a picture of a blazing fire. I picked it up and began reading this article, which was a pictorial about a group of fire jumpers and the work they do fighting forest fires. The article had stirred something up within me. As I looked at the photos, those men arm in arm, with their faces covered in black soot, I realized that I had found my destiny, and it became my reason to live. I spent the next year researching and training, doing everything that I needed to do in order to become a fire jumper. The reality was that I already had my foot in the door, thanks to my Army training. I'd been on several hundred parachute jumps, and I was still physically fit, but during the year of training, I bolstered my fitness even further. On top of all of that, I was a certified field medic. Thanks to my training and experience, I was welcomed into the team in the northwestern United States. Now, fire jumping can be incredibly dangerous. We're dropped into locations where a severe fire is believed to be heading based on terrain, fuel supply, and direction of the prevailing winds. Our job is to create fire breaks so that once the fire makes it there, it will run out of fuel, and if we did our job properly, the fire burns itself out. Once we're dropped in, fire jumping can be a very lonely affair, and we must be attentive to the advancing fire at all times. In many situations, the only help we can rely on is ourselves and air support, though in some cases we can receive ground support if we found suitable areas for them to reach us. When we were in the heat of it all, it was not unusual to see all kinds of wildlife running about here and there. Herds of wild horse, deer, everything else you can imagine run for cover, trying to escape the flames and smoke. One August, a lightning strike started a blaze in Northern California. There were already 5,000 acres ablaze when we were called in. We began to work in an adjacent hillside opposite from the most intense area of burn, felling trees and clearing the underbrush. We worked on clearing this break for hours before the team leader made the decision that we should climb the hillside and work our way down to the canyon area to our west. A thought was that if the fire advanced in the direction of the canyon, it would either burn out by the edge or burn down into it, making it easier to contain. Everything in this business is a gamble of what-ifs. As we began our descent, we noticed a line of creatures walking away from the canyon and heading north. They were black in color and walking like men. One of the members of our team pulled out her binoculars and said they were Sasquatch. We couldn't believe it, but we were all given a chance to look through the binoculars ourselves and had to admit that it was true. There were 3 large Sasquatch and 1 smaller one, fleeing the smoke and impending danger like all the other creatures. We had no time to continue watching, but had plenty to talk about. When we made our way down to the canyon and had begun our work, forming a line as was always the case, Steve Mays and I were the closest to the canyon's outcroppings. The 2 of us now occupying the area that the Sasquatch had just moved through. About 2 hours into work, Steve said, "Hey, what the hell is that?" He paused and then added, "Oh my God, it's a person. Or what's left of them anyway." We both laid down our tools and motioned for the team to come down to where we were. We stood there looking upon the skeletal remains of a human being with its clothes still on. The clothes were weather-beaten so much so that the bones were visible through the fabric in many areas. The skeleton seemed to have been there for quite some time and was wedged between 2 large boulders. As we stood there, we all started realizing that something was not right. The body had a collared shirt on, but according to the direction of the boots we're facing, the shirt was on the skeleton backwards. After a minute, one of the men pointed out that the shoes were on the wrong feet as well, and there was also no skull present. We wondered who the hell would walk around in the middle of nowhere with their shirt backwards and shoes on the wrong feet. There was no backpack or any type of gear whatsoever present, with the corpse only the remains of a blue shirt, a pair of tan trousers, and brown hiking boots. There weren't even socks or underwear visible. We started wondering if the clothes had been removed from a person at some point in time, but who or what wouldn't have known how to put them back on again in the right way? I mean, if you are going to go through the trouble of dressing a dead man, it's easier to put the clothes on correctly. We all agreed not to touch the remains too much, though we did try to see if there were any types of identification, and we could find none. We all knew that this person didn't just lie down where we found them. This body must have been jammed into where we found it, and it didn't get dragged there either. Someone or something had pushed the body into the opening to hide it. We also knew that we weren't going to carry this skeleton out, not without an investigation at the very least. However, given the fire and the current state of affairs we found ourselves in, there was no help in sight. Over the next couple of days, the entire area may have been overrun with wildfire. We radioed to find our command, and we continued to battle this fire over the next 10 days. At some point, we met up with ground support in order to relay where the body could be found. About 1 week later, 3 of us went back into the canyon with law enforcement. Thankfully, the fire had spared that particular area, and this time, we had come back in with a couple of stump jumpers, which were beefy off-road fire trucks. The sheriff's department was now treating this as a full-blown crime scene. When we started telling them about the clothes being on wrong, they said that this wasn't the first time they had seen or heard about this. They said that there are quite a few bodies have been found in that fashion over the years, with some saying that it may be the MO of a mad serial killer. After that day, we didn't hear about that body ever again. Now I know that you are interested in what we saw as far as the Sasquatch go. First of all, anybody who has a brain could tell that we were not looking at large people walking away from a fire. Secondly, even at a great distance, we could tell that the walk and stature of these creatures was inhuman. Their steps were very wide-spaced, and the upper body has a definitive forward lean. The third and most definitive characteristic of these creatures are the arms. They were long, swung forward and backward when they walked, moving very slow and deliberate. You could also see that when they turned or twisted their upper body, the arms would flail outward, seemingly almost like the movement of a carnival ride that was the twirling swings hanging on chains. It was very distinct. Today's second encounter. My friend Artie and I met during boot camp. Artie's real name is Arto, which he told me means bear man in Finnish. I thought it was rather remarkable that his entire family was pure Finnish heritage. All of his family had migrated to the United States in the late 1800s and all lived together in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in Alger County. During boot camp, Artie and I hit it off well. Whenever we could get a moment to sit and talk, we did. Over time, I learned that he and I had quite a lot in common. The two of us shared a great love for the outdoors. We both fished, and we both liked to shoot. However, he was a hunter, and I had never hunted per se, preferring to spend my time shooting sport clays. During this time in the service, we agreed to visit each other on our home turfs after the military gig was finished. In the summer of '85, I packed up my truck and headed to Artie's house in Michigan. I'd made a point to pack my 12-gauge semi-auto Beretta, which Artie had advised would be needed for protection. When I asked him what we would be protecting ourselves from, he said that bears were the primary problem. I thought that was fair enough, though I wondered what else may also be living there. I spent 2 days cruising up into his neck of the woods, and when I started getting close, everything was all woods. To me, this place was like a primeval forest. I mean, there were only gravel and dirt roads surrounded by thick, primordial pine forests, and I could only occasionally catch sights of a house or building here or there. After having been turned around numerous times, I finally found my hacienda. It was quite the spread, consisting of one large house and a smaller one, both surrounded by a number of barns and outbuildings. I pulled into the driveway and hit the horn. Suddenly, it was as if I was in the middle of a family reunion. People, both young and old, were springing out from everywhere. They were greeting me as if I was the prodigal son returning home, and I thought to myself this was going to be a good time. After the initial meet and greet, I was given the nickel tour of the homestead. One of the barns was like a machine or blacksmith shop, and these dudes had everything. Apparently, Great-Grandpa made a lot of metal tools and goods, both for himself and the surrounding residents back in the day. Another barn was loaded with professional lumber yard and milling equipment. As it turns out, his family had harvested much of the lumber that their home and the homes of many of their families in the area were made out of. These folks were made from the real stock. They knew what to do and how to do it, and they were proud of it. As the day continued into night, Artie shared the itinerary for the next 9 days. His plan was for us to first tour around and see the surrounding sights, followed by some camping, hiking, fishing in the truest wilderness style. It all sounded great to me. After dinner had been prepared and eaten, which, by the way, was served up in true Thanksgiving style, his father had taken me into the den to peruse the family's gun collection. They had 3 gun cabinets lining the room. Each cabinet had been handcrafted as the collection grew, and all their wood had been aged differently, one looking more beautiful than the next. They had 47 guns, rifles, shotguns. The drawers beneath the cabinets were stocked with handguns. I tell you the truth, I had not seen that many guns before this, but these were so fine that they could be museum collection. To top it all off, the family knew everything about each gun, and I do mean everything. We spent 2 hours or so just in front of the gun cabinets talking. I was receiving an education in each firearm's history, who made them, and the country they came from. It was at this time that Artie pulled out a large handgun, saying, "Allow me to introduce you to Harry." It was a .44 caliber that he had bought after seeing Clint Eastwood's detective exploits in Dirty Harry. That sucker was a hand cannon, not a handgun, and Artie said that in the morning we could shoot it. This gun was obviously his baby. After the next morning's breakfast, we went outside with Harry in hand. We must have shot 100 rounds. My hands hurt, my shoulder hurt, my ears were ringing. What a bitch that thing was. We then walked over to one of the buildings, which we had not been in yesterday. As Artie swung the doors open, there was a huge beast of a monster truck. It was metal flake blue and glistening like a star. It had a cap of each color, and on both sides was sprayed the name Littlefoot. In retrospect, the choice of name seemed almost foreboding. It was his version of the original monster truck Bigfoot, made with a '69 Ford F-250 and powered by what he said was a blown 428 engine. He had installed all kinds of blocks and shackles under the body and added everything and anything you could imagine to make the truck reach for the sky. The exhaust system consisted of headers going into cherry bomb mufflers, and when he fired it up in the barn, the timbers shook. The cab was accessed by a billet aluminum steps and handrails. This truck was like an adult carnival ride. It was unbelievable, and for the duration of my stay, Littlefoot was our primary mode of transportation. Artie took me everywhere, and I learned everything there was to know about the region. It had been a tremendous logging area, and up until just after World War II, copper mining had also been a huge industry. He told me that the local mines had produced more mineral wealth than California gold rush. He also said that the forests were packed with black bear, wolves, moose, deer, gray fox, red fox, bobcat, porcupine, hare, rabbit, and everything else you could imagine. No wonder he told me to bring my shotgun. We took a boat ride to see Miner's Castle and the Pictured Rocks, which were gigantic and beautiful glacial formations. Most of what we were seeing and doing was in the area called Musen. He brought me deep into the areas of woods there. I don't remember if all of the forest was called Hiawatha or just a section of it, but it really doesn't matter. All of the woods were the same, vast and dense, without a soul to be seen. There were waterfalls, both small and large, located here and there. Artie said that something like 2 or 3% of the state's total populace lived in this area. Even though it represented a third of the state's total landmass, people were a scarce commodity here. After 2 days of running around and having a blast, we returned to the homestead to prepare for our camping, hiking, and fishing adventure. Out in the barn, Artie took a small stepladder and placed it near the rear of Littlefoot. He opened the tailgate and the cap. He had already hooked us up with everything we needed in the bed. There was a fire extinguisher, a shovel, a chainsaw, a first aid kit, and a variety of ropes. He said that one of the ropes was to hoist our perishable foods into the tree, so that the area's bears wouldn't get wind of them. He also had 2 large water jugs, the kind you see at Little Leaguers games, and a large cooler that we were going to fill with ice. The rest of our supplies were canned items and some dry goods, as well as a case of Gatorade and more than a few brews. On the interior sides of the bed, Artie had built some racks made of wood. On one side there was a rack for long guns, and on the other side there was a rack for fishing rods. He had already put a pair of fishing rods and several spinning rigs. He even had electric winch on the front and rear of the truck. Hanging around here was like being in the fire department. Having prepared ourselves with everything humanly possible, we took off. Artie said that we were heading into an area near Train Lake and River. The way in was fairly long, consisting of a decent dirt road which led into some real four-wheeling paths. We had to break out the chainsaw in the truck on 2 occasions to clear some downed timber from the trail. And it was clear to me that no vehicle had been in here for a real long time. The trees we had cleared must have been laying for years. The whole traveling ordeal took us about 2 hours before we finally reached a small, somewhat clear area where we could set up camp. Now, when I say clear, it was more or less an opening in a standing pine with debris scattered everywhere. Artie said that many areas had been replanted after the logging industry had ravaged a fair amount of forest, which led to a hodgepodge of young and old pines occupying the same space. We set up camp, dug a fire pit, which really didn't take us much time at all. Once we were done, Artie said that there was still plenty of time left in the day for us to head down to the river and catch some trout. So we grabbed the fly rods. Artie took Harry and I grabbed my shotgun before we started walking. Just so you understand, at this stage in my life, a long walk for me was going in and out of the mall, with a 2-mile bike ride sprinkled in from time to time. My legs were shot, but Artie told me that we're getting close to our destination. He knew this because the forest started to tighten up. There were a lot of smaller trees and brush as we got closer to the water source, and there was no longer anything resembling a trail. We're looking for breaks in the growth and fighting our way through the bramble when we suddenly broke free of it all and spotted the river. Now, we are not talking about the Colorado here. You could easily walk across this river. In fact, as I looked up and down as far as I could see many of the tree branches flanking the river's edge, and not more than 8 or 10 feet from touching the branch on the side. Additionally, this river was strewn with wooden rocks. It was relatively calm flowing water, and as I began to focus on the surface, I could see that there was plenty of trout to be had. We began fishing. The 2 of us were using terrestrials, which are flies that are tied to look like a variety of insects. Because of the tightly spaced trees, You really couldn't cast much from anywhere near. We were more or less flipping and mending the flies into position. We must have been fishing quietly for several hours, enjoying the company of ourselves and the fish. It was really beautiful, and I was more relaxed here and now than I had been in a long time. I'd almost zoned out of existence when I started to hear a loud rock clinking noise. To me, it sounded as though it had to be very close. I turned my head to look at Artie, and we made eye contact. He shrugged, we kept fishing, and the sound kept happening. It sounded like two rocks clanging together against something big being smashed. There was a distinct crunch. It reminded me more of breaking of a mussel shell than a clam shell, since the mussel shell is much softer and thinner and makes a more crunching sound when broken. As the sound continued, the two of us began to slowly walk towards each other. I was trying to look in the sound's direction, but because of the tightness of the river with the overhanging branches and the river's curvy nature, it was impossible to see very far. The source of the noise could have been 40 feet away, and we still would have been unable to see it. When we got close to each other, we whispered so quietly that we might as well been lip-syncing. Artie thought it may have been a moose antlers clacking together, and that the noise may well have been further away than it sounded. Somewhat reassured, I slowly moved back into the pool I had been fishing in, but this time I made a point to position myself a little closer to the bank in my 12-gauge. After a while the noise stopped, but now I could hear something moving about in the brush, and it started to freak me out. I could see Artie craning his neck as well, fighting to see movement in the trees. We came together again, deciding to wait it out a little bit longer, then split, hoping that whatever was moving around would head out. As we began fighting through this brush on the way out, I was really on edge. I expected something to get the jump on us at any moment, and between holding the gear and shoving trees around, there wouldn't be much time to mount and shoot if need be. I started to think of my old friend Dave. I had met Dave, or Fat Dave as I called him, in the parking lot by the lake. I used to go there to study in my car, and I would see Dave and some other guys who were always there. They fished in a light tackle and worms, catching bluegill and sunfish. While getting out of the car and stretching my legs and talking to them, I found out that he was from Florida, and I could see a large scar circumventing almost the entire shoulder. I happened to be studying for my medical field, so I asked what type of surgery he had. He told me that while on tour in Vietnam, he was on sentry duty, walking back and forth on the camp's perimeter. He and another GI would walk in a half circle and meet again in the middle, going back and forth over and over again. As he was walking, he heard a twig snap, and as quickly as he turned, some gook had already bayonet buried in his shoulder. As he tried to move, the Viet Cong kept forcing the blade around in him. He had been falling to the ground when, instinctively, he mustered up his M16 with one good arm and emptied the entire magazine into the creep, killing him. Anyway, I felt the same way right now. All the way back to camp, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling out of my spine, and the forest was deadly quiet. You could barely hear us walking, let alone anything else. Finally, we reached the camp, and I began to make a fire while Artie stepped behind some trees to take care of business. A few moments later, I heard a startled shout. "What the hell is that?" I walked over to see. He stood looking at a large snake on the ground, which had knots tied in both ends of its body. It looked like a snake dumbbell, but it was still alive. There was absolutely no way these two knots were tied by the snake writhing around on its own. They were as tight as a rope knot. Taking into account the shortening of the knots, the snake must have been 6 feet long. We couldn't help but wonder who or what might have been in our camp while we were gone. The entire thing was mind-boggling, Artie took the snake and flung it into the woods, saying that it would make a good meal for something. Now, maybe it's because I'm somewhat of a city boy, but I couldn't see how Artie could be so stone cold and unmoved about this thing. After spending a night around the campfire bullshitting about everything and anything under the sun, we stoked the fire one last time and crawled into the tent. I had my semi lying by my side, and Artie had Harry next to his head. Artie was snoring, but I couldn't sleep a wink. I was too busy thinking about what happened during the day. Sometime during the night, I started to hear some grunting and grumbling sounds outside of our tent. It was hard to tell if they were near or far until a large shadow was cast between our tent and the fire. After a few moments, the shadow had completely darkened our tents, followed by a large, deep growl. With this noise, the top of the tent started to move downward. Artie stopped snoring. With my eyes fixed on the shadow, I grabbed my shotgun, and before I could even think about shooting it, Artie sat up and squeezed 3 consecutive rounds right through the tent. The flash and concussion was unbelievable, and the smell of cordite and smoke filled the confines of the tent. Whatever this was let out a scream, which I can only describe as being that of a T-Rex. It was so loud that it shook me. The side of the tent was burning, and the shadow had vanished. Whatever this was sounded like it was running away screaming and bellowing as it did so. I unzipped the tent and burst out with my gun. There was no way I was going to die without a fight. Artie leapt out behind me, and the two of us stood there, heads moving left to right, looking and listening. This beast was still screaming off in the distance. I'm not sure that Artie had nailed this sucker with 344 bullets at point-blank range. If it was a black bear, it would have dropped where it stood, but it didn't. It ran away. I asked Artie what the hell could limp, let alone run away with 344 slugs in it. His answer was that bears can be tough mothers to take down. Now, I had been thinking of doing exactly what he did. I was going to shoot as well, but at that moment, I had thought about it being some loser dude in the woods playing a really bad and possibly deadly prank. Flashlights in hand, we started looking around for blood. But we found nothing, and the ground was so hard that we couldn't even see any prints. Not even those from our own boots. Beyond the glow of the fire, our surroundings were as black could be. It was extremely unnerving, to say the least. We got the fire going, hot and heavy, and stayed up for the rest of the night. At this point, I was ready to call it quits, but I didn't want Artie to think that I didn't have any balls. I was a city slicker. We are supposed to have nuts of steel, right? According to our game plan, we had 3 days left. So in the morning, Artie, seemingly had brushed off everything that happened during the night, suggested we head over to the lake today. So we grabbed our spinning rods and guns and headed off to the closest side of the lake. This time his direction took us through a marginally more open track of woods until we got near the lake. Then the undergrowth thickened up like it had been by the river. At any rate, we positioned ourselves along the lake's edge and started to throw some poppers and spinners, getting into some fairly decent action quickly. The sun was out on the lake, and it was nice to be out from under the canopy of pines. While we were fishing, I noticed something large and dark in color peering in and out of the brush along the far side of the lake, first in one place and then in another. Every time it appeared, I pointed in its direction, asking Artie to look. Despite all of my prompting, he saw nothing, but I definitely saw something that was alive and moving, and I couldn't get my mind off the campsite incident of last night. We must have been fishing for about 6 hours or so, taking a few food and drink breaks in between, when Artie said that we should head back and maybe do some little variety hunting before sunset. It sounded like a good idea to me, so we began the long walk back. By this time, we had gotten back to the vicinity of camp. We had been gone about 8 or 9 hours. As camp came into view ahead of us, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. The entire campsite, including the truck, had been ransacked. There were things thrown in the trees. Our cooler was completely flattened on the ground. It looked as though a steamroller ran over it. Cosmetically speaking, the truck was in ruins. The cap looked like a tree had fallen on it, and both the side windows were blown out. The cab had been smashed down so severely that we couldn't open the driver's side door, and there was no evidence of a log or anything that would or could have done this degree of damage. The tailgate was partially torn from its hinges and bent under the rear bumper. The front winch was torn completely away from the truck. 9/16 bolts and washers ripped cleanly out of the steel, and the other winch had all of the cable pulled out of it and was completely detached from its housing. Both of the aluminum steps were torn off, and we were only able to find one of them. Even then, it was in its mangled state. Thank God the cab had not been opened. The front of the hood from the grill inward looked as though it had been hit with 3 or 4 blows from a 12-inch wide tree trunk. I say this because I have no other way to describe what I was looking at. And having said as much, there wasn't even a single indicator such as bark chips or even any marks on the vehicle, which would have shown that part of tree had actually been used to wreak the destruction. There were no small dents in the truck, just large, long, wide blows on the metalwork. What bothered me most of all was the type of power that would be needed to flatten the large igloo cooler, and the fact that the large bolts had been torn away from the truck, leaving a reverse dimple where they had been in the steel. It was insane. Whatever did this was not an individual or a group of individuals. No man could have done this. We said nothing to each other. There was nothing to say. We simply stood there, aghast. I jumped up into the bed of the truck and tried to push up on the broken cab in effort to open things back up a bit. I was forcing my back against the broken roof of the cab, and as I worked my way into position, I noticed something very odd. Caught in the very end of one of the cracks in the fiberglass was several very long, dark-colored hairs. It looked as though something with hair had lost a few while their bodies slid or dragged off the roof. I showed them to Artie, and he said nothing to me. These strands were like 8 to 10 inches in length, which was way too long to be a bear. We gathered up all of the stuff we could and shoved it under the remnants of the cab of the bed. We grabbed the tailgate and flexed it back and forth until we could twist it up onto the bed. When we came into camp, everything in the truck had been neatly organized, and as we were about to leave it, looked like an open trash can. Artie climbed up into the cab from the passenger side, which was not an easy task without the step, and started brushing the shattered glass off the seat. The truck started right up, and he let it run. I guess about an hour had gone by since we came back to camp, and it was time to get the hell out of here. It was a long ride in, and it would be a longer ride out. As we left, I couldn't help feeling really bad for Artie in numerous ways. After all, I came in his invitation, and now his truck was in ruins, and we were leaving with our tails between our legs. What would his family think? What would anyone think? When we finally got clear from the woods, we started heading down the road. At some point, we saw a cop coming the other way, and Artie waved him down. As he stopped, I couldn't see him because of the truck's height, and the fact that he was on Artie's side. I heard him ask what had happened to us. Artie shut the truck down and jumped out. We spent the 45 minutes walking around the truck, telling the officer our tale. He wrote up the incident report and gave us a copy, saying that there is shit in these woods that we know nothing about. Later on, as we entered Artie's property, everyone came to see the truck and talk to us about the ordeal. It was at dinner that evening that his father began telling us about what his father said to him. He told us that loggers and miners had spun many yarns about giant hairy creatures that they had seen in the timber. He said his father told him that they would mess with and damage their equipment after the workers had left for only one day. They would come back the next morning and find machinery bent, broken. He said that this was regularly happening to the workers, and that men would speak of things being thrown into the camp without being able to see who or what threw them. At any rate, that's my story. Artie and I still speak to this day, and he actually rebuilt Littlefoot. Artie's father took the hares that we retrieved and framed them in the den for family posterity. I haven't been back to visit Artie since. Today's final encounter. We were traveling through the western New York region near Medina at around 10 p.m. about 2012. We were taking the country roads as opposed to the thruway and decided stupidly to stop alongside one of the many farm fields dotting the rural countryside. I was curious to get a look at a variety of corn my girlfriend told me about. Apparently, farmers grow some type of corn solely intended for animal consumption, and it's unsweet with large, tough kernels. It was late summer and the weather was nice, so why not, was my thinking. I approached the peripheral edge of the field by a section where the drainage ditch was not so steep. My girlfriend remained by the car on the other side of the narrow road, which was bordered on both sides by cornfield and intersected. It must have been a clear night because the field and its rolling contours were easily visible. What we saw next is difficult for me to express, difficult because I find myself in sort of a tug-of-war between what I saw and how I see the world. What I saw doesn't fit into my general world view. My girlfriend says she first saw it leap across the road, and I saw it running at a frightening rate of speed across the barren section of fields. It seemed to be covering absurdly long distances in mere seconds. It was large. To me, it looked like a hairless wolf on steroids, with an enormous, almost horse-like head. It made absolutely no sound that I heard, and as it traversed the field, it barely seemed to touch the ground. Its four legs looked parallel to the ground when stretched in full stride. I was so taken with what my eyes were seeing, like not knowing what I was looking at, and in the moment thinking, that can't be real. I'm misinterpreting what I'm seeing. It was hypnotic. My girlfriend claimed she was screaming for me to get into the car, while I continued to watch this thing run, beginning to realize that if my judging its speed correctly, it could change directions and be upon us in several seconds. My girlfriend says that only after she said my whole name sternly did I acknowledge her and rush to the car. I still don't know what we saw, since I'm not given to supernatural explanations. I've wondered if it was possibly a wolf-type dog, perhaps a hybrid, that I hear farmers used to guard their fields against. My girlfriend insists that it was no dog or even a wolf. Its size and speed completely preclude the possibility, in her opinion. It never snarled at us, but being that I was so utterly transfixed by it, my girlfriend maintains that I was oblivious to the danger we were in. She actually said a prayer after discussing the event. I'm reluctant to offer guesses of its dimensions. I scrutinized it from distance while it trekked across the barren section of land, so it's difficult to get a good sense of scale. Maybe 7 to 9 feet. I'm really not sure, but it's the largest dog I've ever seen. Its snout was too pointy to belong to a Great Dane, so I'm at a loss. I've considered calling a commercial farmer from there and simply asking if they use large dogs to patrol their fields, or if they've heard of a practice being employed by other farms in the area. Honestly, it seems unlikely just because of the potential for lawsuits if it attacked a stranded motorist, and the lack of any predators in the area. Who would steal some stalks of corn meant for animal feed? But who knows? And there you have it, folks, today's second half, which I do hope you all enjoyed as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you all for supporting the channel. It is, after all, your support that keeps the channel growing and going, and what gives folks like us a place and a chance to share our experiences and theories judgment-free, just simply treated with the respect that we all deserve. Thank you. Everyone, please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real, they are out there, and they are dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the truth, and God bless.